Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney and I'm an evolutionary astrologer. What we're going to be looking at in this video is how Pluto has impacted United States culture and put us on the trajectory that we're on today. How did we get here? So I'm really going to look at Pluto since its founding in 1930 and each of the signs that really roughly correlates to the different generations. And I've picked out Plutonian historical events so that I think shaped really, United States culture at the time and sort of what that time period was known for. So please know that I'm not a historian, I'm an astrologer. This is an astrology video looking at history. Obviously, there are so many more things that transpired within these 15-year periods. But what I wanted to look at was some of the bigger things that we've all taken out of it and how it has impacted who we are as a culture and a society, and what I think this means and portends for Pluto and Aquarius. Let's talk a little bit about Pluto's representation in mythology. So Pluto was the god of the underworld, but he also represented wisdom and destruction and the potential held within, unseen in the unconscious realms. Pluto represents great power, transformation, and the potential to heal deep wounding. So that's all pretty good, right? Like we say, but we have to recognize that nobody likes to acknowledge their unconscious. It's unconscious for a reason. The unconscious and things that we deny, things that we repress, things that are, not easily accessible in our day-to-day world are not accessible because we're not really that interested in wading around in this heavy, dark material on a day-to-day basis. Frankly, if we did, we would become paralyzed, a lot of us. The unconscious is there to protect us a lot of the time. And so keeping in mind that there are these gifts that the underworld can bring to us, but we're only ready to unearth them when we're ready to unearth them. And Pluto transits tend to be times that trigger an opportunity for us to become more conscious of what's going on internally inside of us. So in personal Pluto transits, when you have, let's say, Pluto conjunct your sun or Pluto opposing your Venus, right? These are things that are saying okay, Pluto conjunct your sun, it's time for you to actually own the fullness of who you are. It's time for you to step into your power. It's time for you to actually acknowledge the places that you have not acknowledged in yourself and become aware of them. Okay, and there's a healing opportunity there. But it's often painful, it's often hard work, it's often jarring, it often requires something coming from the outside to help us wake up and see that what we've been doing is not in the fullness of who we are. And let's say you have a Pluto opposing your Venus, right? You maybe have given away your power to your partner for far too long, and suddenly there becomes power struggles, and you recognize that you need to take better care of yourself, and you need to be more aware of the places you give yourself away to a partner. So these are just a couple examples in our own personal lives, and also more collectively. Due to the slow movement of Pluto, people with Pluto in a specific sign in the zodiac belong to different generations. Everyone born around the same time will have Pluto in that sign. The house position and aspects it makes to other signs or other planets in your personal chart are where it can illuminate deeper truths and meaning for you personally. But that's what we have to realize. This is a generational thing because Pluto takes such a long time to complete 12 signs, a full cycle, 12 signs of the zodiac. Okay, so we're really looking at, in this video, Pluto since it was discovered in 1930. And when it was discovered in 1930, it was in Cancer, and we're going to talk all about that. But it was there for a long time, and everyone born at that time had Pluto in Cancer. Okay, now for each individual person, Pluto in Cancer may have been in their first house, or it could have been in their 9th house, or it could have been in their 11th house. And that means different things for different people. So each one of our individual charts is a little bit more pieces of the puzzle for who we are individually. But in this video, we're looking at collectively, because we all do experience the signs collectively. And when Pluto is in a sign, like I said, it roughly correlates to a generation. And, I would argue that those are the generations. And that's kind of how I'm going to be presenting this material. Again, you can disagree with me and you can say, well, no, millennials started in 1980. And, okay, but for the purposes of this astrological Pluto presentation, I'm saying that millennials started in 1983, 1984. So just keep in mind, it's about Pluto's influence on our culture, okay? So the little bits of the years different here and there, just pay attention to the bigger picture is what I would ask you to do with this video. So let's talk about Cancer. Pluto in Cancer. So the years for Pluto in Cancer is 1914 to 1939. Okay. So this is the silent generation. And these are people born within that time frame. Again, if you go and you look on Wikipedia, they'll probably have slightly different years. But for the purposes of this video, let's kind of just look at the silent generation being those born when Pluto was in Cancer. So what is Cancer? Cancer energy is the great mother. Cancer is, I wrote down some notes, so you're going to forgive me if I'm reading a little bit, but hopefully it'll make it richer. She represents security, home, and comfort. She's emotional and offers respite from the fears of the world. A good mother feeds us, nurtures us, protects us, and makes us feel safe. She's our homeland and our country. She's our security, our nationalism, our tribe, and our family. In her highest form, we feel loved and cared for by this energy like no other. When the shadow of Pluto resides in Cancer, all that represents these themes becomes threatened. Okay, so when Pluto enters a sign, no matter what sign it's in, Pluto's basically saying, okay, I suddenly want to focus on this. This is what I'm going to focus on. And it takes all of the themes of Cancer and says, where are you getting it wrong? How can we shine a light on the places where, we've fallen off a cliff, basically, and looking at how we are not providing security for our loved ones. We are not protecting our homeland in the way that we need to. So when Pluto and Cancer collectively, we may be forced to learn what it feels like to be stripped of our security and our sense of home. The shadow that Pluto often shines a light on is the dark mother collectively who starves us, doesn't care about our feelings, and abandons us at every turn. So another thing that I want to bring up is when Pluto is in one of the cardinal signs, which is Cancer, Capricorn, Libra, and Aries, their rulerships represent angular houses. This means that they're very potent and they tend to be more dramatic, and Pluto's a little bit more empowered to show us where we need to change because they're the main themes in our lives. And, the shadow can feel even more existential when Pluto is in a cardinal sign. Much happens during these times when Pluto crosses over an angle in our personal lives as well. There is kind of a shakeup in the things that have to do with the self, the family, the relationships, our position out in the world. These are kind of the main themes that make up the human experience. And so when Pluto touches something like that or is in a cardinal sign, it's basically like an even stronger wake-up call that something's wrong. It's much less nuanced, let's put it that way. So when Pluto was in Cancer, it was a very active time. It was a very dramatic time. And the silent generation had to put up with a lot of BS, to put it mildly, because I've done work with a lot of clients. And if you have a really toxic mother, it can be so unbelievably damaging. And basically we've had, during Pluto and Cancer, it was like a collective toxic mother. And so here we have World War I. And this is a war that, you ask most people to articulate what World War I was over, and they don't do a very good job of it. You can say something about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, but like, what? That's kind of strange. And it was this really horrible war that, was just based off of complex alliances and kind of, the vague notion of the homeland. And it was kind of like just people mad about stuff, like, but not, it was very complicated, but not very clear. And so there was this big giant war with like trench warfare and chemical weapons. And it was very, very traumatic to the men that fought this war. I mean, it really, took that generation out in a lot of ways. And it's argued that the war only came to an end because the Spanish flu outbreak, which of 1918, because so many people were dying on on the battlefields just of illness. And so basically there was kind of like this truce of like, this can't go on. And so, then people come home, they've got like all this war trauma, and then we've got a pandemic that is wiping out large swaths of the population, including young kids and younger people. So unlike COVID, the pandemic of 1918 actually killed a lot of, men and women in their 20s. And so very different than like the elderly that were passing away. So it killed the Spanish flu pandemic killed 20 million worldwide, and 500,000 in the US. And if you think about how much smaller our population was, that was, it's a significant amount. So then we have people who are not, especially men who went off to war, head of family, it was very patriarchal society, really not really knowing what to do with their grief and their emotions. The United States at that time really wasn't equipped to take care of people's emotional world. It was a very survival of the fittest kind of situation, and people came over to escape very harsh conditions in other places, and they come here, after a war, after surviving a pandemic, come here from other countries, and alcoholism was running rampant. And so Pluto in Cancer, Pluto is the great mother. Well, a bunch of mothers got together and said, this can't go on any longer. And so they joined with the church, and that's when the prohibition movement came into being. And women get the vote in 1920. Yeah, so Cancer represents women, and the Great Mother had a solution. Enter Prohibition and women's suffrage movement, meant to give women agency and help their families become whole again. Pluto in Cancer's matriarchal energy said, no more, we need power, we need to clean up this act. 1919, the Prohibition movement passes, and in 1920, women got the right to vote. With their newly found power, the feminine sign of Cancer was ready to party, and men were ready to rebound from their trauma. Entering the roaring 20s with jazz, booze, dancing, short haircuts for women, shorter hemlines, fast cars, and a stock market bubble that would awaken the Dark Mother once again. So there's a lot of partying going on in the 1920s, but it's a little bit of that, kind of like, well, all of that pain and suffering from the pandemic and the war were still there, but it was like we could kind of go have a little fun and get a break. And women felt empowered for the first time. I mean, think about what a drastic change this is from just, like when you enter the 1920s and women are like, in speakeasies dancing, and there is just this complete changeover because women suddenly start to feel an awakening of their life force. And Pluto in a lot of ways is a life force, and Cancer represents women. And so women suddenly were ready to, like I said, cut their hair and wear shorter skirts. And think about just 10 years earlier with those long black dresses and kind of the more matron, it was the first time women felt a little taste of freedom. But it was kind of still Pluto in Cancer, and the Dark Mother was about to come out and smack him on the back of the knuckles. So in 1929, we experienced the stock market crash and the Great Depression. This time was the epitome of the dark and depriving mother archetype, with people starving, lining up in bread lines, unable to provide for their families. Men were leaving home to find work, Some left because they were simply ashamed of their inability to provide for their family. We have to remember that that was a very, you were a man, you had to provide for your family, and a lot of men tried, but there were not jobs available. Women were so poor with no social safety net, they were forced to give up their children to orphanages to raise. Charity from the church was the only way some survived the Great Depression. Safety and security felt like something of the past for most of the country. There was an environmental catastrophe unfolding due to modern farming practices at the time that neglected natural cycles of the earth. So the Dust Bowl made the region uninhabitable for so many that they became known as Okies, traveling west to find greener pastures and escape their personal Plutonian hellscape. And just as Pluto was discovered in 1930, the U.S. was taken down to its foundation during this time and forced a reckoning around the country's ability to protect and provide for its citizens. The country had to find a way to somehow provide for and protect its people, its children. Such tragedy on a wide scale in our country required a leader for the ages. That's when we got President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His leadership against the will of politicians who cried socialism, the WPA, Social Security, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established a federal minimum wage, was adopted. The country's first social safety net was established in response to the devastation of the Depression, and an anti-monopoly and financial regulations were passed to help ensure that there wasn't that stock market sort of situation again that really kind of screwed everything up. Okay, so just when people were kind of finding some semblance of security again with the Great Depression, kind of at least having some solutions, Pluto went into Leo. And this is the baby boomer generation. And so Pluto in Leo is 1939 to 1958. So just when people were gaining a semblance of security in the face of significant losses in recent decades, in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and a year later entered World War II. So let's talk about how important Pluto and Leo generation is and why it has been so influential in our country. So Pluto's entrance into Leo, it did give some new hope for people, because it was suddenly like, okay, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. Even though World War II, clearly was devastating, it was more of a heroic war. It was a war of purpose. It was a war that did help pull us out of the Depression. So the Sun in Cancer, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, they're all in Cancer in the United States natal chart, the founding of the country's chart. So there's sort of this sense that the country had to become what it was destined to become, which was this leader, this democratic leader of the free world. But in order to get there, it had to go through this really challenging Pluto and Cancer hitting all of those personal planets in the United States chart. So when Pluto enters Leo, there is kind of this collective sigh that like, we got through it, we survived, we are stronger, we are better. And so we're better poised to enter World War II in this kind of heroic way. So Leo is the king of the jungle. It's a sign that represents the sun. It's known for its pride, creativity, self-expression, and leadership. When Pluto is in the sign of Leo, it's empowered to take the lead and act with decisive action that can be self-serving, showy, and sometimes over the top. So keep in mind, every single sign has a high side and a low side, a shadow side. And Pluto's going to bring out the shadow a lot of the time. So there's going to be gifts. I do think that people during the Great Depression, they all, came together. The amount of community that people shared and generosity and kindness, like neighbors relied on neighbors. Churches were the source of food for people in the community when the government was not helping them yet. So, I think I watched some TED Talk about why Social Security was founded was because there was a teacher who had taught her whole life and she was living in a chicken coop. That's real. Like when there is no help for you and there is no Social Security and there is no, that's a reality that some people just need help. Not everybody is good at saving. Not everyone has been given generational wealth to be able to be okay in their later years, right? So this whole is a very modern concept that, and also teachers, going back a bit, weren't allowed to marry. Okay, so here we have women were supposed to be teachers, dating back like prior to the 1930s, like the turn of the century and before, they couldn't marry. That was part of the deal. Well, okay, men were the ones that could purchase homes. They could purchase so if the community didn't take care of the local school teacher when she got older, where was she supposed to go? She didn't have, and if she didn't have a family that was still alive or around, like, somebody that could take care of her brothers or, then, that's how you end up getting a woman who dedicated her life to children living in a chicken coop. And that was honestly like the founding story of Social Security. Just a little aside. Okay. All right. So, yes. So in the U.S. Sibley chart, the North Node is in Leo. The United States' destiny to lead, rise above, rise to the occasion, fight courageously when called. So during World War II, men fought bravely. And women came to the rescue on the home front. Everyone was willing to sacrifice and pull together, and the country found tremendous energy and pride in fighting for our allies. The citizens of the United States got to be true heroes. This was true for men. This was true for women. This was true for, Black citizens. This was like everyone was heroes. And the ticker tape parade celebrated this heroism, and the soldiers were welcomed home with newfound opportunities for wealth, comfort, belonging. But that was the promise. But women were swiftly sent back home from their jobs with a pat on the head and told to procreate and clean the kitchen again. Black soldiers were sent once again back to the back of the bus and told to use a different drinking fountain. And often their homes during this time were lost. Even if they had just a little bit of generational wealth, it was lost because of freeways, being specifically designed to go right through Black neighborhoods because there was all this expansion going on. So, here we have like, oh, we're so awesome. But like, we're not, once again, we're kind of missing the boat as far as, really thinking about everybody. This was a really great time to be a hero, right? Like, oh, you're the hero. You came back from war. Now, this also sweeps under the rug a lot of trauma that men had to see during war. So this was kind of a like, here's your prize. You get to be the king of your own castle in this suburban neighborhood, and we're going to have this big, freeways everywhere, and you're going to come home and you're going to have babies galore. And, this is sort of, the eminent domain, though, for Black people and white flight. Well, that was right around this time as well. So the detonation of the atomic bomb in 1945 was very emblematic of Pluto and Leo. This was a bomb of all bombs. It was unmatched in its destruction. It clearly established who the king of the jungle was on the world stage. The story told to U.S. citizens that it was necessary to end World War II. It was done to prevent further casualties and suffering at the hands of Japanese soldiers. Maybe this is the mythology, this is the history that is taught, but that it was the dramatic destruction. It did accomplish its intended purpose, but at what cost? Something that Pluto and Leo's shadow isn't necessarily concerned with. Pluto and Leo likes to win. That's a very Leo wants to win. Leo is kind of competitive, and it's really to win at all costs. So yeah, the United States was very good at writing that narrative in the United States' defense. It's a complicated picture, and we were instrumental in ending World War II, which was a pretty devastating situation. And we did help rebuild Japan, and we had learned some of the lessons from the dismal response after World War I. So we really did, it catapulted us to being world leaders. That was the intention of Pluto and Leo. And during this time, we also have the rise of celebrity and fame, which is very Leo. That culture's full effect. So in the past, we had movies, but the studio owners were the ones with all the control. But then you have people like Elizabeth Taylor, who captivated the entire nation with her romantic escapades and, the gossip columns. And she became the biggest star at one point and was commanding these really high salaries that were unheard of before. And so the power really switched over into this more celebrity culture versus kind of the more traditional, like, men leading the studios. And so that was kind of new and turned things on its head. You had TV shows like Leave It to Beaver, Father's Knows Best, Donna Reed. They were all emblematic of this time, kind of projecting a perfect image of a happy white family with kids in a beautiful home. Very patriarchal. A lot of assimilation up the wazoo, because Leo cares a lot about what other people think about it. That's very Leo. So with a rising middle class, a functioning democracy, wealth equality, and then the financial windfalls as a result of the end of the war, the United States was really on the fast track of success, which is also a Leo theme. So the Pluto shadow, however, includes an obsession with image versus reality and the need for that approval from others. So Pluto and Leo strength is creativity and self-expression. This is a time that, people boomers, when they were born during this time, there are spectacular artists and musicians who really did help change the world that were born during this kind of Pluto and Leo time. And that really is that they embody that in their chart. That's generational of the boomers. But this was also a time when Joseph McCarthy terrorized people that were seen as different or other. And Pluto and Leo was really hell-bent on making sure the U.S. emerged as a world leader. But again, there were a lot of consequences of this. So, here we're becoming a superpower, we're becoming superheroes, but things like racism, sexism, the demonization of the LGBTQ community, these were not issues easily faced when we were kind of invincible in our own minds. And I think that's something that the Pluto and Leo generation holds within them. And, they're still they're still ruling the world. The boomers are still in charge. And these are the seeds that were planted during that time. This kind of like a little bit more hyper masculine and very, this kind of patriarchal, wanting to be a hero. And if you're told you're not the hero, Leo takes that really personally. Leo is very sensitive. And you don't think of Leo as sensitive, but they have a fragile ego. And because their ego is so powerful in a way, like it's so necessary for them to feel appreciated and loved and accepted. And that's also why you see a lot of the Pluto and Leo generation holding on past the point that other generations potentially, have held on to leadership, because there was this sense of like, well, there's a duty. We have to be the leaders. We have to be the ones that do, make the changes that usher in the future of the world. So one of the things that really strikes me about each one of these generations, or, subsequently, if you don't want to think of it generationally, just think of it as like Pluto entering the different signs. Each one is really kind of a reaction to what came before. And that's very much true of the zodiac in general. So when you have Pluto in Cancer, there's all of this pain and suffering and, really a lack of security, a lack of safety, feeling like you don't know what, when the shoe is going to fall next kind of thing. And so Pluto and Leo really had to address that pain and had to step in and say, no, we are leaders. We can do this. We can rally together and we can feel invincible again. We can feel strong. We can feel like the world leaders and the superpower. And that really was Pluto and Leo's job at that time, was to kind of pull us out of that morass. But then you have Pluto and Virgo. And Pluto and Virgo comes in and says, okay, that might all be great and true, but there's some people you're neglecting here. And so Virgo is about service, and Virgo is about the workers, and Virgo is about the people who are doing the job. And there's an idealism to Virgo. I love Virgo, in case you can't tell. I get Virgo. It's my moon. So, Pluto and Virgo. Virgo likes to be of service. It's a sign that sees the ideal and the potential. Virgo can be critical, but it's in the name of improvement. Coming off a period where Pluto celebrated assimilation, appearances, and, kind of the white male hero, Pluto and Virgo was ready to bring that Leo hubris down with a few pegs, with a little bit of reality. Are we as great as we think we are, is what Pluto and Virgo was trying to say. Like, where's the humility? Where's the humbleness? So it was kind of like, let's take a step back and look at our country with a critical eye. So suddenly you have the boomers coming of age, going off to college, and they are sort of thinking about things differently. And so, we are leading the charge against the spread of communism during this time through our involvement in Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, but it was getting much more complicated than when Pluto was in Leo. And it was just kind of like, oh, it's on, like, we're the leaders, we helped win that war, we saved your butt. Like, there's that kind of, like, oh, we're so great, we're Pluto and Leo, right? But now that optimism kind of came to a screeching halt. So, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where things weren't exactly going the way we thought they would. Korea was a little bit of, it was definitely a warning about what was like to stay out of Vietnam. And then, in 1963, Kennedy's life was taken prematurely, and it was incredibly traumatic for the entire country. People always say they know exactly where they were when Kennedy was killed. Earlier that same year, the country had begun its racial segregation reckoning. And so 1963 was a really big pivotal year. So you had the Freedom Riders, you had MLK's I Have a Dream speech and his March on Washington. And Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. And that challenged the notion that women were only good for domestic chores and kind of pumping out children, right? Like, we have brains, like we don't want to just be shed away. And that was really a reaction to the 50s assimilation and kind of putting women in a specific role. So Pluto and Virgo was getting down to business, making lists and crossing off human rights to-dos. Like, by 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act being signed by Johnson, which then proved to be very, it was a big earthquake, and we're still dealing with that. 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed and became legal for married couples to get birth control pills. Very big deal. In 1966, the Miranda rights were established in the Constitution. So think about the fact that there were no, like, if the police wanted to arrest you before, there wasn't these rights to a lawyer, and you weren't told that you had these certain rights. And juries were all male, all white men, So, back in the 50s, like, if you did something as a, you were accused, at least, of stealing something as a black man, you didn't have a jury of your peers. You had a jury of white men. So big changes were happening. So I like to call this generation, well, I don't personally like to, but I identify it more as the Zoomers. It's a little bit boomer, because the boomers were coming of age, but it's a little bit Gen X, because this is like shorter periods of time that Pluto was in these signs. And so these early Gen Xers would kind of be Gen Xer now, or late baby boomer. Some people call them Zoomers. And I think that that's very accurate, because it really has to do with this Pluto and Virgo. So, yeah, Pluto and Virgo attending to day-to-day chores at home, and the tangles of the past were starting to become clear with the Vietnam War. I mean, it was deadly, it was complicated, and Virgo was like, this is really not cool, Like, all of a sudden, we're seeing entire villages on the nightly news suddenly, being burned. And all these baby boomers who were getting to be voting age, who were kind of taught that they were the heroes of the world, were having these kind of hard truths put in their face by Pluto and Virgo. It was like, oh my God, well, that's not what a hero would do. And so you started to get kind of this rebellion against the war and calling out of places where the U.S. needed to clean up its act, basically. So then you have in 1968 another, earthquake with Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy both killed, and everything ugly. So it was kind of like the shadow really, really came forward and couldn't be ignored any longer. So, that this was kind of, I think it took the baby boomer generation, and it really just kind of was very shattering to them, because they really did grow up thinking that we were the heroes and there was this mythology, and it wasn't all myth. I mean, there's a lot of truth to it too, but it was kind of like, how could this be? How could this be happening? And so Virgo did have another one of its to-do lists that it was able to cross off, that it did the landing on the moon. So take that, Russians. That's basically what Virgo was saying there. But it brought the idealistic notions of free love, hippie communes, and exposed the kind of dark idealism, dark side of this idealism. And so the darker aspects of the human shadow really kind of came forward at the end of the 60s with rampant drug use, Charles Manson, Jim Jones's People's Temple, which was so idealistic that was very, consequential and emblematic of this period where people were trying to make this idealistic, better society, but it was crashing into the reality of human corruption and human failure and human frailty. And if you don't know who Jim Jones is, that's where he's the cult leader where, we get to drink the Kool-Aid from. But if you ever watch any documentaries or anything about that, people were forced to drink the Kool-Aid. That wasn't something that they lined up for in the way that it's portrayed. There was people with, guns at their children's heads and things like that. It's pretty dark. Pluto and Libra. So again, everything is kind of it builds, right? So it was clear that things had gotten out of balance with Pluto and Virgo at this point toward the end of the 60s. And so Pluto and Libra, again, is a reaction. And Libra was ready to take the job on of getting things back to normal. Libra doesn't like violence. Libra doesn't like riots. Libra likes things very pretty and wants everyone to get along. So Libra wants equality and fairness, and, she can be kind of wily in the way she gets it. So we have the Vietnam War finally coming to an end. But, what better way to welcome Pluto and Libra than a scandal involving governance, law, and justice? In 1972, we get Watergate. And that was all the rage of that time. Nixon was the villain that Pluto and Libra could take on through reasoning, diplomacy, rather than violence. And so then when Nixon resigned in 1974, Pluto and Libra didn't need to get her hands dirty because Gerald Ford gave Nixon an unconditional pardon. Wasn't that nice of him? Pluto in Libra is not super decisive either. That's a shadow of Libra, is really not knowing what's the right thing to do. So we want Nixon gone, but we really don't want to go through a big trial and put the president behind bars. Would that be fair? So Pluto in Libra was pretty torn, and so was the rest of the American populace. So they settled on a couple of its aides going to prison instead of the president. But again, that has consequences down the line. So every single one of these things is like Pluto's trying to clean up the messes by showing us where we got things wrong in previous generations. Because as humans, we have a lot to learn. So, yes, by 1973, Pluto and Libra gave women a big boost with the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade. Suddenly, women, for the first time in American lives, had bodily autonomy. It was highly controversial. The decision was celebrated, however, by the majority for giving women equal footing when it came to family planning and healthcare decisions. And by the late 1970s, the U.S. elected Pluto. They had a Libra president with a Libra rising in Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter comes onto the world stage as a very Libran figure. And Carter was instrumental in establishing Middle East peace with the Camp David Accords, ending 30 years of fighting between Egypt and Israel. All very Libra. Libra is about peace treaties. Libra is about equality for women. It's about justice. So you see these themes, right? So Carter returned the Panama Canal. He successfully negotiated the Iran hostage crisis. Reagan was credited because he made sure that hostages were not released until the day of the inauguration. But it was Carter that negotiated those the hostages' release. And it's very, very interesting how history is repeating itself with that, as far as a scandal and challenges that were dealt with the current administration but don't come to fruition until the administration after. Also of note, Pluto and Libra got the first Supreme Court justice that was a woman, was Sandra Day O'Connor. And here's the other thing with the 1970s, and here's the shadow, too, of Libra. Libra is everything beautiful, right? And Libra is relationships. So these are some Libra themes. But we start to see kind of, you know how the 70s is known for like its really hideous fashion? Basically, the 1970s was just a really interesting time. And we also start to see that by the end of when Pluto is in a sign, the shadow becomes more potent. So we start to see, disco is very popular. We see very gender-bending styles, like think of David Bowie and glam rock. Nothing wrong with disco or glam rock, by the way. The ERA, women's rights, white women entering the workforce in significant numbers for the first time. Think like Mary Tyler Moore. But here's where things are, get a little dicier. Divorces are rapidly on the rise. That can be a really good thing for women's autonomy, especially because, women in abusive relationships, they previously didn't have avenues for escape. Up until this time, women couldn't get a credit card or a mortgage without their husband or father co-signing. A lot of women don't know that, but that's real. So suddenly women have more autonomy, so they're leaving. But then that is like... Is that the solution too? Was a better solution maybe, kind of understanding the two genders, coming to a better place, helping men be better fathers, having more equality within the home rather than just tearing apart the families, which has then also resulted in, new generational traumas and new problems in the country. So, I really believe that through all of this, us humans are doing the best we can with the energy that's coming at us. But you start to see like these really crazy fashions and things like that toward the end of the 70s. And so it's just interesting to see like the dark side of Pluto in Libra. So then we have Pluto and Scorpio. And the zodiac sign associated with Pluto is Scorpio, meaning the two have a great deal in common. Both are the domain of death, power, sex. Pluto's at home in Scorpio. So now we enter the Ronald Reagan era. So power, money, drugs, sexuality, these are all things on the forefront, again, in the very go-go 80s. Remember Greed is Good, Wall Street, that movie? During the 80s, the crack epidemic, which was, tearing apart inner cities, there was basically the solution to that was like a PSA that says like, just say no to drugs. And like Nancy Reagan was like going on different strokes saying like, just say no to drugs, kids, which clearly didn't work. So, while her husband was out there demonizing welfare queens and selling trickle down economics, that laid so much foundation of suffering. Nancy Reagan famously had her own personal astrologer in the White House that was advising the Reagans, including Ronald Reagan. So there was kind of this thing where, astrology is very much associated with Scorpio, and it's kind of the occult and things that are a little bit more outside of, traditional. So this was kind of a hush hush thing, but there was like a Vanity Fair expose about it. And, they had an astrologer, and that was a little bit what's attributed to his sort of Teflon, like he kind of got away with a lot of stuff. So Pluto and Scorpio definitely would have approved of that astrologer being in the White House. But during this time, we have regulations dismantled. Tax policy becomes much more corporate friendly. Building on the work of Nixon, jobs begin to disappear en masse, headed to China. So manufacturing, that was the backbone of the United States, begins to crumble. So with prices coming down because things could be produced so much cheaper, items that the middle class would have had to save for, or were maybe considered luxury items, like a brand new TV. Like, maybe you were getting along fine with your black and white, but now you can afford a bigger screen color TV. So people were kind of willing to overlook the fact that these policies were sending middle class jobs away. And, the seeds of materialism that really would explode in the coming decades, because subsequent presidents built on what Nixon and Reagan started. And, really that materialism then, along with greater population and all this deregulation, an undoing of things of the New Deal, like the New Deal from the 1930s has been being undone ever since the Reagan administration. And, that's you can attribute that at the feet of every single one of the presidents that came after Reagan, including Clinton and Obama in a lot of ways. So, I don't hold any one particular person accountable, but I think people become emblematic of these, our leaders become emblematic of these Pluto in a specific sign. So the 1980s also brought us a mysterious disease that was affecting gay men, and Pluto and Scorpio's AIDS epidemic shattered the lives of so many people. It wasn't until there was a young boy, Ryan White, that had AIDS that became something that could no longer be ignored. So it was no longer just a gay man's disease. It was something that was in fact, impacting everyone. And so, sex was now something to be feared. So very Pluto and Scorpio. Homelessness, taking money away from the middle class and giving it to the upper class, that's Pluto and Scorpio. So that trickle down economics, which also is a total scam. But anyway, that's another video. Pluto and Scorpio brought us the traumatic space shuttle Challenger explosion. I was in the 6th grade when they wheeled in the TV and we all watched it explode. So that's very Pluto in Scorpio, kind of like in your face, death. Even, also nuclear proliferation, like everyone was, talking about nuclear bombs, the Iran-Contra, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, savings and loan federal bailout, the first Gulf War in Kuwait, which was largely believed to be about oil, and then the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings on Capitol Hill. So these are all big Pluto and Scorpio themes that I've pulled out. The millennials born at this time were really imbued with a sense of optimism, materialism, and the concept of safe sex. So the millennials, are children of the boomers, and they still have this kind of hero mythology. That's a big part of their upbringing, is that we are the leaders of the free world, and we have to there's a degree of entitlement that starts to rev up a little bit by the time we're getting to Pluto and Scorpio, just in time for Pluto and Sagittarius. So let's look at Pluto and Sagittarius. So Pluto was feeling his oats when Pluto was in Scorpio, and that bred a lot of optimism. So the country in general was feeling ready to party. Sagittarius is the sign of optimism. It is the sign of expansion. It's ruled by Jupiter. So it likes to make big, bold moves. It likes to feel invincible. Sagittarius can feel very dogmatic at times, very opinionated. The high side of Sagittarius is making bold decisions, is feeling confident, is feeling like the world is your oyster, and you are ready to party and have fun and expand. But the shadow, as we keep talking about, every single one of these has a shadow, and Pluto brings out the shadow. There can be religious dogmatism. There can be an acting without thinking, kind of just rushing in without really thinking through the consequences of those actions. There can be an overconfidence, an oversimplification, a feeling of being invincible when you're not invincible. So these are very Sagittarian themes, and a lot of what we were gonna come to discover were lessons that we needed to learn. So Sagittarius, like I said, likes to do things big. And here we have the Clinton years. We have in 1994, Clinton signs NAFTA, so the North American Free Trade Agreement. So building on what Reagan did and Nixon did by, kind of sending our jobs elsewhere, but lowering the cost of things, it's this kind of double-edged sword, right? So we're getting rid of our jobs, we're getting rid of manufacturing, we're getting rid of opportunities, but we're lowering costs. We're increasing materialism. We're kind of feeling like the world is at our feet. So NAFTA was very people were very conflicted with NAFTA when Clinton first signed it, but I think it has proven that it was a lot more complicated than initially thought. One of the big repercussions of NAFTA was that the drug trade shifted to Mexico, and it empowered drug cartels. That was an unintended consequence. And I think with Pluto and Sagittarius, suddenly there are a lot of things that become unintended consequences. So there was also the Clinton blue dress scandal. So the 90s, really this Gen Z, 1995 to 2008, is a time of scandal and, kind of tabloid. And, the media just goes wild. This is a time where all of a sudden our trusted media institutions are doing really well. This is before the internet explodes and takes away all of their financial opportunities. And they're just kind of flush with cash, and they're just, giving the people what they want, at least what they think they want. And so that, really was very traumatic for Monica Lewinsky. It was traumatic for our nation in a lot of ways, because a lot of energy was being spent on this sex scandal, when the truth of the matter was the people who were investigating him were cheating on their own wives. So that's kind of interesting. So we have further expansion of trade agreements with China. There is the election between Bush and Gore. So the Clinton years come to a rather dramatic halt when there is the election with Gore and Bush and the hanging chads, and that is decided by the Supreme Court. And it, and it really left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, because shortly after, we didn't think too much about it, because 9/11 happened in 2001. And that, there's your religious dogmatism, Al-Qaeda, that was Muslim fundamentalists, that was people that hated America, that wanted to take us down a few pegs, that attacked our financial system. So, coming and crashing planes into the World Trade Towers was very symbolic of really showing Americans that we were not invincible. And so for the first time, there was this sense that, wow, this is the first time since World War II that we had a feeling that we were not invincible. And so that led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which didn't exactly make sense to most of us at the time, or at least many of us. I would say there's quite a few people that were buying the propaganda, and here, the media lied us into these wars and were parroting propaganda with B-roll that was false. But, it was really kind of labeled that you had to be a patriot and talk about canceling, the same people that were eating freedom fries because France didn't want to support us in this war that didn't totally make sense. Were burning their Dixie Chick CDs. So it didn't make sense. And Iraq really had nothing to do with 9/11. And the weapons of mass destruction was a lie. And so this is a time of lies and exaggerations and people believing their government, people believing the media. But if they were really listening, they would have also heard dissenting voices that said things like, you break it, you buy it. What is your exit strategy? So again, Sagittarius and Pluto, overly optimistic, believing that it knows best, and kind of showing the hubris of Americans that, when anyone has kind of a dissenting voice, they were being shut down, they were being shamed, they were being canceled. So it's interesting to see that becoming such a big talking point by conservatives 20 years later. Interesting, maybe a point of self-reflection for some people. Big tax cuts for the rich by Bush W. And then we had Katrina. So these are all, Katrina, again, climate change denying, this can never happen to us. And this was kind of the very first major climate change wake-up call. And so there was, again, this sense of we were all Americans at that time. So there was a national tragedy that everyone rallied to support the people of New Orleans. But it also was a bit of a racial reckoning because, people got to see firsthand the conditions some people were living in, and that people were unable to evacuate. And, people were on their roofs, writing things like, help me. This is also, there's two other big things going on at this time. The Catholic Church scandal. So we have the rise of ISIS, we have Al-Qaeda. Islamic fundamentalism. But at the same time, we have what's going on is we have the rise of megachurches and evangelical Christianism. So we have a rise of that kind of belief system that is incredibly dogmatic and taking place and is being is joining with the government. So suddenly these mega churches are really taking political sides, and it's on a grander scale than we've ever seen before. But we've also seen the fall of these preachers, these kind of bigger than life characters living this sort of fabulous life of, the rich and famous, private jets and mansions and things like that. And so it becomes like they're almost like a cultural phenomenon versus a religious phenomenon. But at the same time, we're also having the Catholic Church scandal. And so we're seeing, kind of the dark side, like the materialism, the opulence, the politicization of the church. And then the more traditional church, we're being exposed to the fact that there was this really disgusting, horrible secret where people had priests had been molesting children for forever, and the Catholic Church just moved them around, knowing full well that these people were harming other people, harming children. So that is another big kind of scandals and lies, and and then we have things like My Super Sweet 16, is a TV show on MTV where you have these kind of bratty 16-year-olds who are getting Porsches and Range Rovers for their birthday. And so there's this glorification of wealth and opulence, kind of this, just over the top, really kind of ugly materialism, vapidness, kind of the rise of the Kardashian culture and reality TV. During this time, you also have things like Jerry Springer show, right? So kind of the moral decay and the moral deterioration of society. So this is kind of planting the seeds where everyone feels sort of optimistic and things are, we're on top of the world and we can buy all this stuff. And this is where people then get really kind of screwed over with buying homes that they can't afford, and they are not reading the fine print, and they're not thinking through the fact that this mortgage has a balloon attached to it. And so your payment might be XYZ right now, but it's going to be 3 times that in 10 years. And so there was this sort of just people rushing in and not thinking through the consequences. And that was what Pluto's shadow had a lot to do with, this war that we were fighting. What was the exit strategy? How were we going to get out of it? We were not welcomed as liberators. And, Bush had that mission accomplished banner behind him, which really became emblematic of the fact that this was a never-ending war. And we had no idea what to do at this point because we've locked people away in Gitmo, and then we've somewhat liberated these women in Afghanistan who were being oppressed, and we put the Taliban away, but we don't really know, other than running this, these countries, which we couldn't do ourselves. It was a very complicated and hairy situation that was never going to have a good outcome. And so that's a big part of what was going on during this Pluto and Sagittarius time. We also have the pharmaceutical industries and greed, that is the opioid crisis. So a lot of the seeds of the destruction of kind of our trusted institutions. So we no longer can trust doctors because they're writing prescriptions for their own benefit, and they're being paid off by the pharmaceutical industry. So now, it's at the time we still trusted the media, at the time we still trusted the government, at the time we still trusted our doctors and the pharmaceutical industries. And we kind of had this more traditional belief that everything was going to be okay, because for a while it really had been okay. But the seeds of that destruction through greed and overconfidence and, abundance run rampant really destroyed a lot of lives. And that reckoning was about to come when Pluto went into Capricorn. So we have Capricorn, which is Gen Alpha, 2008 to 2025. And I'm going to run through this one pretty quickly because we've all just lived it. We've talked a lot about it, but this is the foreclosure financial crisis. This is where all of a sudden Capricorn is about paying the piper. Capricorn is about responsibility. Capricorn's about integrity. And if you've not been living in integrity, it's going to show that to you. It's going to have you pay the consequences for your actions. And so there was kind of this return to, we really wanted to believe when we elected Obama, there was hope and change, right? Those are very Sagittarian themes. This is where our mindset was someone's going to help us. Someone's going to bail us out. Someone's going to fix this. things are going to change. We're going to get back to normal. But that didn't happen. And the bankers got bailed out because that's Pluto and Capricorn. And that is the larger institutions, that is the media, that is the government, that is the banking system. They are the ones, the wealthy got wealthier during this time. And people that had mortgages that they couldn't pay because of derivatives and all sorts of irresponsible behavior by bankers and mortgage lenders lost their homes. And so people really were losing faith in the system. And so, we got a new healthcare system with the Obamacare, but, it really rewarded insurance companies. And, it wasn't structured in such a way that people were going to benefit the way that it was intended. And so, we have this just rise of corruption. We see it everywhere. There's a rise of bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is only intended to make wealthy people wealthier and the rest of us suffer, to shrink the middle class. And so, jobs are sent overseas for customer service. And customer service, so there's women's jobs just being sent overseas to India. There's the spiraling of the, calling and getting no answers. Like there's no accountability any longer for the trusted institutions. And then we have 2010, we have Citizens United, which really is the straw that breaks the camel's back, because now money is being injected into our governmental system on an unprecedented level. And that's where we get the dark money and the dark money donations. And that's where we get the empowerment of the billionaires, and we get the CEOs and everyone suddenly making tons of money that was already making tons of money. So now it wasn't just having one yacht, it was having 4. So, and meanwhile, we have a rise in homelessness. This is when we have, after the 2008 crisis, we had the Occupy Wall Street. And we are, coming out of this period where there was tremendous gerrymandering in 2010, which then made our political structure far more extreme. And, there was no need to compromise any longer because it was about ambition. It was about greed. It was about corruption. And it was about filling their own coffers. And it was very successful, in all honesty. So, then we get Trump, we get Biden, we get inflation, we get COVID. It has been, as we all know, a very challenging time. And as I said at the beginning of this, when you have Pluto in a cardinal sign, like it was in Cancer, now it's in Capricorn. Cancer is the great mother. Capricorn is the great father. So the father archetype on the positive side is someone who takes care of you, who protects you, who provides for you, who watches over you, who has tremendous integrity, who is not super emotional maybe, but is the patriarch of the family and is responsible and is really going to protect and make sure that the home is safe and sound. So those two are on the same axis, right? They're both, in their own ways about family and home and country. And so the dark father, however, is someone who turns their back on you, who is stoic, who does not provide and protect, but turns within and really is overly ambitious, is only caring about their own needs, can be very narcissistic, can tell you, they're looking out for you, but they're not really looking out for your best interest. They're looking out for their own interest. And so that's kind of some of the dark father energy. That can be also anger and violence. And so we saw a rise in people being very angry with one another, and a lot of division, and a lot of just being torn down and not feeling very hopeful any longer, like a loss of hope. And so when a father figure, someone like Trump, comes in and says, I can fix it, I will take care of you, that's where you get the strong man that people want. They really want someone to help fix it because it got so darn broken. And so, after COVID, a lot of really, really challenging times for people, just like with the pandemic of 1918, where there's grief and unprocessed emotions, unprocessed grief, a lot of trauma and collective trauma that was exacerbated, frankly, by people not turning to one another and helping one another. And really just kind of helping themselves. A lot of people stole money from the PPP, right? Which was intended to really only help people that were going to be falling on hard times as a result of lockdown. But you have like millionaires and billionaires claiming this money as well. So everyday taxpayers are then funding, mass amounts of money for people who are already incredibly wealthy. So the lack of integrity, it was all about me, and selfishness. So you can sort of see how they build on each other, right? So we have the overconfidence of the Sagittarius time. And now here we have to sort of pay the piper, but we're not prepared to. We don't have the emotional maturity baked in because that hasn't been something that has been valued. The traditional values was something that we had lost along the way of taking care of your neighbor and protecting and providing and having integrity. And so there was, children stopped going to school, and, there were a lot of consequences. So now we have Pluto in Aquarius. This just happened. We got a little taste of it in 2023 and early 2024, but it officially went in right after the 2024 election and in November. And so that's what's here now is Pluto in Aquarius. And the themes for that, Aquarius on the high side has to do with humanitarian issues and what's good for the collective and what's good for the people. How can we make things better for everybody instead of the individual ambitions and greed and climbing? So on that side, there's a lot of potential for equity, and there's a lot of potential for advancement for those who have been downtrodden, poverty, women's rights, Black rights. But as we see, the shadow is what kind of comes out, unfortunately, to help teach us lessons and correct. And so right now we have technocratic billionaires coming in to, in a lot of ways, run our government. People like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and JD Vance are taking very large roles in our government, and they're kind of saying, well, people need a little pain. So Saturn is the traditional ruler of Capricorn, and Saturn has to do with the people, but it also is about restriction, and it can be challenging. And Uranus is ruled both traditionally by Saturn, but also by, Aquarius is traditionally ruled by Saturn and also Uranus. So I think this is a time of tremendous change. But I also think there's a cautionary tale around technology. And I think we're going to see huge technological breakthroughs. I think we're going to be seeing a total technological revolution that's going to change all of our lives. Do I think it's AI? Probably some version of, juiced up AI. But is that going to then replace humans? I see already that my son has no idea how to spell anything because he used spell check for everything. And, is that okay? Is that not okay? It's hard to know because that is the wave of the future. And so we're going to be grappling with a lot of these questions about what's real and what isn't real. Where are we supposed to turn when everything is automated? And how do we get back in touch with human emotions? I think it's going to be a less isolating time in some ways. I think people are going to come back together in groups and collectives and have the opportunity to share stories and find one another. And maybe they will find one another over technology. But I also think it's very clear that technology is going to be responsible for people losing their jobs. It's already happening to me. It's happening to a lot of people I know, and that is going to accelerate. A lot of people are losing their jobs because people realize that people are more expendable. We need fewer people to do the work. Well, what does that mean? What then happens? How, so the lesson that I think we're going to need to learn with Pluto and Aquarius is like when we're all in the mind and we're all kind of focused on technology and we're all looking at our phones and we're doom scrolling or we're on social media, where is the humanity? Where's the heart? So I think there's exposing of the dangers of technology. Is there some sort of robot revolution? Maybe. I can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but the themes are around the dark side of technology. The themes are around, revolution of class revolution, people being sick of the billionaire classes taking all the money, because there comes a tipping point where they can only, people can get so rich and people can get so poor and people get desperate. And I think we're definitely at that sort of tipping point where people are much more class conscious and aware of what's been happening and kind of saying no more. So that's going to be exacerbated by these billionaires coming in and having so much influence. And, they don't want to be regulated. So Aquarius is deregulation. So what happens when we deregulate everything? Well, greedy people then put PFOAs in, dump sludge and the air gets worse. And, so there's all sorts of consequences. So I think we're going to be living with some of those consequences. I think climate change is going to be incredibly front and center with everyone. I think that Pluto and Aquarius, along with some of, Gemini and Uranus and Gemini, there may be solutions to climate change. There may be kind of a reckoning where we realize that we can't go on. So the fires in California is already sort of one of these things where it's like the end of celebrity culture, LA being the center of the universe, kind of that Pluto and Sagittarius, everything revolving around Los Angeles. Pluto and Scorpio, New York City was the center of the universe. There's kind of this new sense, like, is Austin going to be the center of the universe now? And it's all going to be about technological advancements. And so, there's a lot of kind of interesting things coming up. But will the fires then cause an insurance crisis that will then force change? So I think a lot of things with Pluto and Aquarius are going to have to do with technology, revolution, class wars. And I think equality is going to play a role in some way. People getting fed up with unequal treatment. Now, this is a generational cycle. So we are just on the very beginning of this. So I think that that's another thing to keep in mind, is what plays out over the next 20 years is a long story, and we are just beginning it. And sometimes things, warm up and like seem okay. And, by the end of it is when you really recognize where things have gone off the rails. And that's kind of the story, like, look at Pluto and Sagittarius. The end of Pluto and Sagittarius was the financial crisis going into 2008. And, really the high level of like Supreme Court corruption and the just general corporate corruption was the end of Pluto and Capricorn. So we start to see a glimpse of things like with Luigi, that's Pluto and Aquarius. So, it can be quite dark. Pluto can bring out the darkest parts of our humanity. But the whole point is to help heal and bring us forward and to, can we rise to the occasion? Maybe sometimes things need to be taken down in order to be rebuilt stronger and better and newer. And so that is my presentation. I hope it's been interesting. I know it went a little longer than I had anticipated. But I hope you stuck with me here. And as always, there is a reason and a season for it all. The cosmos and the universe are conspiring to help us. We just need to take the hint and act consciously and act with this energy with consciousness, because that is going to help make it a lot less painful in our individual lives and collectively. So until next time, stargazers, thank you.